Death of a Game, Star Wars Galaxies. Death of a Game is a series in which I, nerdSlayer, take a look at the games over the past years that either were a death of a franchise or even a company. I then will attempt to speak about the history of these said games up until their ultimate demise. I want to show you guys the most objective experience I can, so I will refrain from going too nostalgic on certain titles. The criteria behind the game being dead would be A. It's actually dead, B. It had a sudden mass exodus of players and never recovered, and C. The game never launched or the company dissolved. At the end of each of these videos, I hope you guys will have a better understanding of why and how the game in question failed. Perhaps knowing such can teach us a valuable lesson on the video game industry, or at least enough to keep us from throwing money at such games or companies in the future. If you are familiar with the history of Star Wars Galaxies and its launch and failure, feel free to press the annotation to skip to the commentary portion of the video. If you are familiar with the internet and the MMO community, you will have likely heard of Star Wars Galaxies. It quite possibly is one of the best video games to be chosen for this series. Star Wars Galaxies was announced in 2000 when LucasArts and Sony Online Entertainment formed a partnership to work on the development of an MMO in the Star Wars universe. Sony Online Entertainment was the previously known as Variant Interactive Company, which was the creator of the EverQuest MMO series. EverQuest had great success, and so LucasArts wanted to be a Star Wars themed MMO to be released. Because of such, they employed Variant Interactive, which was bought out by Sony, and renamed Sony Online Entertainment, or SOE, a company who still to this day can elicit a nerd rage never seen before. Although Star Wars Galaxies was said to be launching in 2001, the game didn't launch until June 26, 2003. It had a closed beta previous to this, and the plan was that they would launch the Empire Divided portion of the game, which would be the entirety of the ground portion of the game, in quotations. Space travel would be done through the use of shuttles, and actual combat in space and gameplay would be later added in an expansion. The interesting thing about this in the current age is that this would be largely ridiculed. People nowadays believe a game should be launched in its entirety, and that if a game launches with expansions so close to launch that it would mean that the game was unfinished. For example, look at the flack the most recent Star Wars Battlefront got, which lacks space combat and even single-player and co-op game modes and maps. However, the developers cleverly stated that this would actually be beneficial, as it would allow players to establish themselves on the ground portion of the game before venturing into space. Not to mention, MMOs are more vast of a game than an arena shooter or a single-player RPG. When Star Wars Galaxies launched, it had a near 300,000 person population of subscribers. Prior to launch, its community was in the 400,000 range, which was a large gaming community at the time. This meant that there was a near 75% turnover rate in customers. However, the game was plagued with bugs. Ralph Koester, a lead developer on Star Wars Galaxies, who is famously known as being one of the lead developers on Ultima Online, said that when the game launched, it didn't actually work. Like, you couldn't log in. But, despite this, the game was still able to boast a few 100,000 subscribers, which was considered successful. In 2004, Star Wars Galaxies launched its Jump to Lightspeed expansion, which was focused on expanding the space portion of the game, but also added things like races and a trade profession that focused on creating spaceships, shipwright. Although the Jump to Lightspeed expansion was in many people's eyes one of the greatest additions to the game, an ode to the X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter series, it didn't add much in content to the actual ground portion of the game. To fix this lack, Star Wars Galaxies then launched the Rage of the Wookiees expansion in May 5th, 2005. This expansion added a new planet, Kashyyyk, and dungeon content that came with it. And by the beginning of 2005, World of Warcraft, created by Blizzard, boasted its population of 1.5 million. Expectations of the Star Wars brand, and also based on the MMO they had created, executives had expected a far better launch than a 300k population. However, expectations raised to abnormal levels when the competition WoW was able to have a population that was more than 5 times the size of Star Wars Galaxy's population. Soon after the launch of the Rage of Wookiees expansion, SOE wanted to launch a combat change that would fix some of the combat issues in Star Wars Galaxies, and also help streamline some of the combat aspects to make them easier for new players to understand. This change was called the Combat Upgrade, or CU, hence the name Pre-CU, and it changed many of the core systems of the combat in the game. The biggest feature being it made combat levels, or CLs, apparent and viewable. Now you knew what your CL was and how it affected combat. Although there were certainly problems in the game's combat, many believed the CU, was too much of a change. Not to mention, it forced certain things on players that were never asked for, like rainbow-colored ability bars and abilities, as well as completely unintentionally nerfing of certain classes and weapons. It was a change that was handled poorly, and the player base suffered due to this. At this point in the game had sold over 1 million copies, but its subscriber base had shrunk to 250,000 active subscribers. Trials of Obi-Wan was the game's last expansion, and was launched in November 1st of 2005. The game added more playable content in the planet Mustafar, as well as more dungeon content that came with it. It also added dungeon content related to HK-47, who came from the KOTOR universe. The next day, the new gaming experience was announced for Star Wars Galaxies. The NGE was supposed to change the entire framework of the game, and was later known as one of the most infamous and large game reworks patches of all time. The NGE destroyed many of the changes that Trials of Obi-Wan had changed just 24 hours before. November 15th, 2005 was the launch of the NGE. The NGE changed the 34 professions of the game to only be 10 professions. You can now play as a Jedi character starting at level 1, effectively rendering all of the previous work that people had spent on their Jedi holocron grind, a grind needed to complete in order to become a Force sensitive, someone who could then be trained to be a Jedi, useless. They completely eliminated the creature handler profession and the crafting profession that went with it. These were later re-added to the game in Chapter 5 update in 2007. The interface changed, and the game's targeting system was closer to an FPS. Crafting had also changed. Before, you had a deep system that nearly let you craft anything, but NGE made it to where you could only craft in a pool of crafts selected by your trader profession. As 2006 came near, the subscription numbers fell to just about 100,000 to 150,000. It seemed that the large changes that hit SWG weren't granting positive results. The community was in a complete uproar. John Smedley, the president of SOE, defended the decision to change the game, stating change was needed in order to fix the game. Smedley also repeatedly told people that detractors of the game were a minority. Smedley believed that straight sandbox games simply didn't work, and that although players would be mad, they would eventually come around and realize the positiveness of the changes. Nancy McIntyre, the lead director on Star Wars Galaxies, was quoted saying, "There was a lot of reading, much too much in the game. There was a lot of wandering around learning about different abilities. We really needed to give people the experience of being Han Solo or Luke Skywalker, rather than being Uncle Owen, the moisture farmer. We wanted more instant gratification. Kill, get treasure, repeat. We needed to give people more of an opportunity to be a part of what they had seen in the movies, rather than something they had created themselves." Julio Torres, the lead producer for Star Wars Galaxies, stated that he thought that the players were resistant to change, and that these players would come by after they had vented their concerns.
Correct. Now, there was a rumor that in one of the cantinas there was a big bowl of punch. Everybody's drinking from it. All their characters are dropping. There's a mass exodus. What is it like? I've read reports that cities are barren, that the user base is now revolting. Is this true? Is this really happening?
Well, there's a segment of players that obviously are going to be resistant to change, and we experienced that in the past when we make enhancements like these. In general, what's really interesting about that is that a lot of them come back after they feel like, okay, they vented their concerns.
They've proven they're the uber nerd that they want their friends to believe they are, and now they're ready to play a fun game.
And so once they try the actual enhancements, a lot of them decide that yes, actually it is an improvement, and they stick with us. So.
This didn't happen, however, and the loss of players persisted for SOE up into the eventual shutdown of the game. This deterioration of players existed even after the mostly new team at Star Wars Galaxies had created an update after update to fix many of the issues that NGE had created or features that were removed. These were sort of forgotten, as MMOs around SWG had beefed up in competition, and WoW kept having continual success. Not to mention the multiple popular news outlets, which raked SWG and its handling by SOE over the coals. The final nail in the coffin came when LucasArts teamed up with BioWare, now EA BioWare, to create a new Star Wars MMO set in the Old Republic universe of Star Wars. This meant that Lucas no longer needed two concurrent MMOs going at the same time, and they decided that they would shut down Star Wars Galaxies. Lucas and SOE announced collectively that the service would be shut down on December 15, 2011, 8 years after the game's creation. John Smedley later was quoted in an AMA on Reddit saying that the NGE was stupid decisions and a complete and utter fail. Julio Torres was never heard from again, and Nancy McIntyre, she became the VP of sales at Lucas and later Leapfrog and CEO of a company called Fingerprint, both companies which ironically focused on children games and applications. Now that I've given you the history rundown on Star Wars Galaxies and its ultimate demise, you will have a better understanding of when I offer the more narrative portion of this video. For this next section, I'm going to break it down into detail, the reasons that led to the game's failure, address some information, and frankly attack the nostalgia goggles levels of delusion exhibited by prior fans of the game. So why did Star Wars Galaxies fail? I will detail aspects of the game that led to its failure, as well as speak on the mishandling by the developers and such. I want to focus on aspects that led to the failure of the game, so I won't talk much about roleplay, crafting, and the aspects of the game which still to this day to me are unparalleled. I'm not here to talk about the positives, I'm here to talk about the failures of the game. Star Wars Galaxies was announced in the year 2000. 3 years later, the game was launched. This is a rather quick launch considering World of Warcraft took 5 years to create, and EverQuest, created by the same parent company, SOE, took 4 years to complete. The rushed launch was further highlighted when the game was announced to only have the ground component with what would be called Empire Divided, and would have a later space expansion to the game. How can you have a Star Wars game without space combat? The space expansion Jump to Lightspeed was launched a year after launch, which proved that if Star Wars Galaxies had held its launch a year, they would have been able to include the Jump to Lightspeed expansion as part of the base game. The numbers of Star Wars Galaxies dwindled by about 50,000, but when the Jump to Lightspeed expansion came out, it shot right back up. Space is an iconic part of Star Wars. I mean, Star is in the name of the franchise, for Christ's sakes. Although the hype was fierce for Star Wars Galaxies, SOE shouldn't have relented to the outside pressure for their launch of the game, a theme that frankly plagued them for the entirety of the launch. I'm going to list a few negative reviews of the game. Atomic Gamers said that Star Wars Galaxies could be a great MMORPG in time, as it has some excellent potential and a solid technology base. But if you wanted a balanced combination of exciting combat, quick progress, and fun PvP, and you want it right now, Star Wars Galaxies is not the game for you. GMR Magazine said, the whole game is a bit too complex for its own good. The skill system itself might put off people who have never played an MMORPG. Play Magazine said, while the social aspect is very interesting in Galaxies, the combat is relatively boring and uninspiring. If I have to shoot one more hopping rodent, I'm going to scream. Armchair Empire said, though Star Wars Galaxies does have the potential to become a better MMORPG, the current version of the game is dull and lacks in quality. Gamers Pulse said, the current lack of content, unbalanced professions, and broken quests and mission still in the game will drive you away if you do not have the patience to wait 2 or 3 months. Computer Games Magazine said, this game might be the foundation of a large-scale and ultimately satisfying Star Wars universe. But it's not that universe yet. Adrenaline Vault said, the experience, for all of its addictive qualities, still feels lacking due to its slow pace and the absence of vehicles and space travel. Yahoo said, its Star Wars atmosphere is minimal, and its advancement is riddled with repetitive, boring, time-consuming experience grind busy work. As it stands, Galaxies is a little more than buggy, incomplete time sync. Now, clearly, not all the reviews are bad, I just wanted to mention the negative ones, just because people seem to have this belief that when the game was launched it was somehow perfect. It was not. It was flawed, like most MMOs that launch. Now the combat. People seem to have this delusion that combat was balanced and pre-CU, or even fun. Now while fun can be debated, the balance certainly couldn't. If you heard the above quotes on the game, the combat was a very disliked portion of the game. Many reviewers believed it would hamstring possible players from picking up the game. The ham system, which was health, action, and mind, were 3 pools that represented physical and mental reserves. Most attacks specifically targeted one of these 3 pools, and any action the character took also depleted one or more of the pools. When any of the pools are fully depleted, you would fall unconscious. Combat then requires you to carefully manage your actions to avoid depleting a pool. The confusing part is that you could have attacks that attack 3 different pools. That all led to your pool being deteriorated eventually, and then you would be incapped. Abilities you cast also used different pools, so you effectively had to manage 3 pools for no explained reason. You also had to worry about attack abilities draining these pools as well. Mind attacks, however, unlike health and action, were unhealable. This is why rifles and swords were effectively the best weapon to use in the game. The combat queue, which was a part of the game early on, listed actions your character was about to perform. Whenever you attempt to use a special combat action, change postures or use special equipment like grenades, those moves appear in a combat queue before actually occurring in the game. In the meantime, you'll continue to auto-attack. In order to clear this queue, you need to either leave combat or press the clear queue button. This is unnecessarily clunky. and the combat queue system has never been reused in any MMO, which clearly shows that no one really thought it was a good idea in the first place. Combat fatigue and wounds were other things that kept you from playing the game. You had to rely on a medic, doctor, or entertainer in order to cure these afflictions. I've made my opinion on this sort of mechanic in my Tyranny video review very clear. Battle wounds are a stupid feature in any game, and they only serve to take away from the ability to actually play the game. Buffs were an important feature of the game in Star Wars Galaxies, where combat was near impossible to be done without them. This is true in almost all instances of Star Wars Galaxies, but it's even more obvious in pre-CU, where you simply can't even play the game without buffs from medics or entertainers, especially when you consider wounds and combat fatigue. Now, the content in the game. Star Wars Galaxies launched, and it severely lacked content because it launched as an unfinished game. This was evident when it was missing the entire space portion of the game. But what people seem to forget is that when the game launched, the most you could actually do in the game, aka supported by the game, in terms of combat content was mission terminals. People sat around farming the same mission terminals, trying to get equipment to be able to do the tougher mission terminals, and then there was just no story. It was just the same repetitive quest over and over again to get experience. There was no profession quests besides bounty hunting and slicing as a smuggler. Although you could become a Jedi, it took knowledge of knowing how to start the process, which I did like this feature. Still, grouping wasn't something that was supported because XP was not shared in groups, at least killing blows weren't. Solo grouping, which is an oxymoron, was just about the only way to play the game, really, as it was more effective than actually grouping. Sure, you could group, but there really wasn't any benefit unless you were doing some of the caves which had tougher level mobs, but there was no real group content. The biggest group content came in the form of PvP, which was a strong feature of the pre-CU. The content in the game consisted of people mostly killing womp rats outside of town and farming terminals. Now, roleplay added tons of content to the game, but that's a player-made portion. That's a sandbox feature. Space combat wasn't in the game yet, so you couldn't fly around in your ship. You had to spend sometimes up to 10 minutes sitting around and waiting on a shuttle at a starport to be able to travel to another planet. Add this with the waiting that you had to wait on buffs and wounds, as I stated previously, and you have sessions that used to be about 20 minutes of you walking around and then 15 minutes of you actually playing the game. Make no mistake, the nostalgia levels of pre-CU are just outrageous. The game was very much bare bones, but because of what features were in the game, it made for a strong sandbox experience. However, sandbox experiences with little to no actual content or new user experiences aren't really helpful in getting people who aren't more of the hardcore crowd. Although Star Wars Galaxies pre-CU was the height of its popularity, and therefore player content like vendors, PvP battles, and crafting, it was the lowest point of actual content in the game. The combat upgrade. The combat upgrade was brought as a means of fixing combat in Star Wars Galaxies, which absolutely needed tweaking. However, it was met with a negative response simply due to the bugs and balancing issues it created. The performance of the game suffered, so no matter if the changes were positive, people had lower performance and balance issues to judge the changes on. Especially when due to certain changes, other professions were inadvertently affected. The Star Wars Galaxies team realized that changes needed to be made, but with like most of their changes, they simply executed them poorly. Lack of QA testing seemed to be a constant failure of SOE, but a common mistake people make is thinking that these changes themselves were a failure. They weren't. They were good-natured changes, however, poor execution was why the CU was seen as negative, at least at first. When the combat upgrade came out, it tried to get rid of the spamminess of the combat in Star Wars Galaxies by giving abilities cooldowns. This way you didn't have to worry about a combat queue. The combat upgrade also got rid of having to manage 3 pools for your attacks and what you are attacked with. You now had 1 health pool, and your action pool was used for your abilities. The mind pool was used for healing. This simplified the process. The combat upgrade also introduced visible combat levels, or CLs. Most people were unaware of what the combat levels were, but they were always present in the game, just not visible. It made it more obvious what the strengths of the monsters were and players were. The downsides of this is that it made it to where the range of monsters that you could kill for XP was rather small, meaning variety of monsters that you could level up on suffered. The combat upgrade was also given incentive to group, as it allowed you to get normal XP when grouping. However, this also affected the lack of content in the game. As people grouped up to farm, they realized missions and things to kill weren't as numerous or expansive as they had once thought. Raf Koster, a former developer, believed that adding group experience, while a good intention, hurt the population as it made people realize how content-less the game was. The NGE, or New Gaming Experience. Although the CU let the Star Wars Galaxies community see a positive upswing in subscriptions, it wasn't enough for the suits at SOE and Lucas. John Smedley, the president of SOE, thought that the game had the potential to reach 1 million subscribers, and wasn't happy with the current progress. They saw themselves as having the most valuable IP in the world, but not the success to back it. The vice president of sales for LucasArts said, "We really just needed to make the game a lot more accessible to a much broader player base. There was a lot of reading, much too much, in the game. We wanted a more instant gratification, kill, get treasure, repeat. We needed to give people more of an opportunity to be part of what they had seen in the movies rather than something they had created themselves." This is a bold statement for someone to make without actually testing the customer base, something SOE later admitted that they didn't have direct control over. The NGE was created in large part due to SOE and Lucas's view that the game was too complicated, and that a sandbox wasn't really a successful sort of game. The new gaming experience came with no warning, and it was never teased or even tested by the community. A day after the Trials of Obi-Wan launched, the NGE was announced and came 2 weeks later. McIntyre, who was the VP of sales at Lucas and also at the time the lead director of the game, "We knew we were taking a significant risk with our player base, but we felt so strongly that we needed to make these changes for the sake of the game's long-term future that we all held hands, Lucas, Arts, and Sony, and we went forward." Apparently she forgot to hold hands with the customers, or at least warn them of the upcoming changes. The NGE cut professions and really hurt character progression in the game. It also cut the creature handler and further hurt traders and entertainers who were also left hanging by the CU update. However, this was likely due to how poorly the update was tested. It was shoved down the consumer's throat, and although it added content like heroics, which were iconic dungeon-type PvE missions, more story options, and the ability to roleplay, as well as more space missions and a new planet, it also launched with a bunch of bugs and imbalances. The NGE gave the game a linear progression, which was later amended and vastly improved, and no choice in choosing their abilities. The NGE was the quintessential example of a patch that was launched far too early, and with not enough customer input. The NGE launched by cutting more content than it actually added, but the misconception about the NGE is that the NGE killed Star Wars Galaxies. It didn't. Constant bad decisions by SOE did. Constant mismanaging of the customer's desires, and lack of transparency is what killed the game. Ralph Koster, a former developer of the game, also believed that the NGE adding a cross-server auction house led to the destruction of crafting-based vendors in the game. The NGE in its later renditions added far more content to the game than any update ever added. It fixed traders and entertainers, it re-added creature handling and crafting for them, it also re-added auto attacks and balanced the professions. It added the collector title, which allowed you to collect certain items and get XP and rewards, and the NGE also added a quest creator, a chronicler, which fleshed out the roleplay features of the game. The NGE added a tutorial that left players with a good amount of resources and a solid start on the game and its other features, which was desperately needed. Although these changes weren't enough to realize the fantasy world that John Smedley and the other top executives have for Star Wars Galaxies, the game was said to have a positive subscriber base and was making steady positive changes towards improving the quality of the game. However, this didn't matter because the game was prematurely pulled to focus on the new Star Wars MMO on the market. Rose-colored glasses and the obsession with the good old days. One statement constantly repeated when SWG is the topic is the pre-CU was the golden age of Star Wars Galaxies. Pre-CU was the real Star Wars Galaxies. I find these statements hilarious because the game was launched so buggy, not to mention that because the developers did decide to involve Jedi were these unstoppable juggernauts. Spam combat was common due to not having timers on abilities, and the game lacked combat content other than mission terminals, which were the same repetitive thing over and over again. Progression in the game was deep, but it was hidden behind the kill the same womp rats type missions. The game's combat experience was so complex that you had to read at least 3 different pages to understand the way aggro, the ham system, and combat levels worked. Not to mention it was unnecessarily complicated, with how the ham system affected your offense and defense capabilities. You were forced to spend at least half of your game time waiting around on buffs, shuttles, or wound timers. The game was the least game it could be at that time. The reason people remember the pre-CU so fondly was because they chose to remember the positive experiences over the very present negative ones. And because players made up for the lack of content and direction of the game, thus they had these memories of their friends and human experiences that they experienced, and those outweighed the technical shortcomings of the game. The pre-CU was a time where the developers were rather transparent with the fan base. The players of the game felt that they understood the direction that the game was going, and that their feedback was going to be taken seriously. But make no mistake, the pre-CU wasn't some perfect phase of the game. It was the game in its least completeness. It's easier to not mess something up when you don't actually take a lot of chances to fix something. It's the old analogy where you miss all the shots you don't take. Well, you can also miss the shots that you do take, and SWG took a lot of shots in its development, and unfortunately it missed a lot of them. The combat upgrade was a good-natured change, it was just handled poorly. The combat was the weakest portion of Star Wars Galaxies, something that World of Warcraft just had this immense leg up on its competition. Sure, the combat in World of Warcraft was simple, it was very easy to play. The combat upgrade attempted to remedy that problem in Star Wars Galaxies, although it had its rocky start. It didn't take away any content, which was why it wasn't vilified like the NGE, but still, at the end of the day, when the dust cleared, the bugs and imbalances were fixed, and the update was mostly positively received. But the NGE, on the other hand, much like the CU, was a rush decision. The NGE was the single biggest patch of all time by the sheer amount of things that it changed in the game. The reason the NGE was so negatively received, besides the bugs as per usual, was that it took away more content than it added, at least at first. It's indefensible that the NGE gutted the profession system, and took away the ability to become both a crafter and a dancer and a combat character, or a combat character and a crafter. Especially initially, the expertise system, where you can choose your own abilities and talents, didn't come until later. So based on initial impressions, the NGE was a catastrophic failure, not to mention that the amount of people that felt betrayed because of that change. It was practically announced out of nowhere, and so people felt like they were cheated on, essentially. However, the NGE didn't kill Star Wars. The previous flubs, like the server-wide auction house, buggy and rust implementation of the NGE and CU patches, and the group XP, which showed how little content was actually in the game, these are the things that killed the population. It was a cohesive, collective effort. It wasn't just some small little thing that was isolated on its own. The NGE was not the single event that killed the game, but people only remember the initial implementation because many of them never came back and played the game after the game stabilized. And it did. The NGE eventually added far more content in the game than any other change. It added back creature handling, it gave crafters and entertainers more skill choices, it added the chronicling system, mission creation, RP features, it added heroic dungeons, it added more in-game loot systems, and most importantly, it added a very effective training module or tutorial mission that took the players and gave them a brief exposure to the game on Tensari Station, and then let them follow a legacy quest up to level 50 as they could be taught things about space and vehicles and other mechanics of the game. But people don't realize this because they never saw the NGE grow into its more current implementation, current in the 2008 sense. But you can't blame people for not seeing it through, especially with how bad the implementation of the changes initially were and how it gutted the profession system. People felt betrayed, and an ignored and betrayed fanbase is unlikely to stick with the game to hope that it goes in a good direction. But, in conclusion, it's disingenuous to say that the NGE killed the game, and that the NGE was a completely negative change. It's also completely crazy to say that the pre-CU was the golden age of the game, when that implementation was not perfect or even close to it. Jedi and their impact on Star Wars Galaxies. As Rolf Koster, a lead developer of Star Wars Galaxies, said on his blog, the Star Wars Galaxy original developers didn't want to even make the Jedi playable. The issues with the Jedi were that they were a clear alpha class, where they most certainly were expected to be much more powerful than the other classes. In order to counter this, Raph and his team decided that they would just make it immensely complicated to become a Jedi, so that only a few people could actually achieve Jedihood. Based on initial calculations, it seemed like it would take people years to achieve Jedihood, a more organic system. However, as you probably expected, this wasn't very liked by the suits around Star Wars Galaxies. They wanted the Jedi to be more accessible. Thus, holocron drops were created, which, when collected, would give you tips on the skills that you needed to master. The problem with the system was that as soon as people figured out that you needed to master skills to unlock the box, everyone else started finding out about it. It became a min-max minigame where people just attempted to master all the combat skills in the game before they could eventually narrow down which skills needed to be leveled in order to become a Jedi. Traders, entertainers, pilots, and explorers weren't a focus anymore. People were focused on becoming a Jedi, especially because it was the alpha of the classes. It is Star Wars. People stopped playing the game and focused on grinding it, AFK if possible. Raph is quoted as saying the subscribers numbers after the holocrons were launched dipped, which they were previously uptrending. When the NGE came, Jedi became a playable class from the start. You could choose the Jedi profession, and you started as a Force sensitive who went on your linear journey to unlock your Jedihood. All of the previous work people had spent on attaining their Jedi powers was in vain, and the Jedi ceased to be unique or even having the same level of power. This most certainly was a contributing factor to the failure of the game, but the Jedi Conundrum is not a hard nut to crack, and you can't necessarily fault them in their failures in implementing such a complicated system. Well, you can, but at least cut them some slack. Everybody wants to be a Jedi. Mistakenly assuming that the Star Wars title equals success as a game. If you remember John Smedley's statements on Star Wars Galaxies, he and his suit buddies believed that the Star Wars IP was the most valuable IP in the world. Because of this, he believed that they should have a widely successful MMO since it's based on that same universe. SOE suits weren't happy with the 300,000 subscribers, they wanted 1 million. However, were any of these expectations based on actual reality? That's debatable. If you look at the best PC selling games of all time in the Star Wars universe, there's only 2 of them. Star Wars Galaxies is the best sold game in the Star Wars franchise on PC, and before that, it's the 1993 on-rail shooter known as Star Wars Rebels Assault, which had a budget estimated at over 1 million. Not to mention that Star Wars Galaxies had a healthy 250 and 300,000 subscriber base. This is bigger than some current MMOs have. MMOs which likely had triple if not quadruple the budget. No one will argue that Star Wars isn't a big franchise, and it isn't one of the biggest. However, this doesn't automatically translate to having a very successful game, especially in the PC space. For example, the only Disney game that ever reached the best-selling PC games list is Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Meanwhile, Lord of the Rings doesn't even have a single game on the list. As Raph Koster mentions on his blog, Star Wars Galaxies had a budget of at least 1/4 of the World of Warcraft budget, and it was created 2 years faster than World of Warcraft was. For such a large franchise to not put up the sort of money they needed to put up is sort of what people should be talking about, not Star Wars Galaxies' quote-unquote failure. Because according to its budget and subsequent sales numbers, Star Wars Galaxies was a commercial success. However, the game wasn't treated as such during its reign, which explained why many of the changes that ended up hitting the game were so rushed. They were hastily made decisions, influenced by expectations that weren't even close to reality. Remember that before the NGE hit, the game was still subscriber positive according to one of the developers. Constant misreading of consumers, treatment of them as children, and a lack of proper QA or community testing. SOE and Lucas didn't just read the market incorrectly, they also read their own consumers incorrectly. People incorrectly assumed that the WoW success was attributed to SWG failing or why SWG failed. But when surveys were conducted by one of the developers of Star Wars Galaxies, they found that the biggest reason that the game was bleeding subscribers was a lack of content. Not to mention that Star Wars Galaxies lost more to its other SOE games, more so than WoW. As Rolf Koster pointed out, because it was the least like WoW after all. Raph was a developer who believed that fans were paramount. He is quoted as saying, "There's no denying it. The fans know Star Wars better than the developers do. They live and breathe it. They know it in an intimate way." On the other hand, with something as large and broad as the Star Wars universe, there's ample scope for divergent opinions about things. These are things that lead to religious wars among fans, and all of a sudden you have to take a side because you're going to be establishing how it works in this game. However, the senior director of SWG at the time, Nancy McIntyre, was content on treating the consumer base like children and telling them what they like. I mentioned a previous quote about her where she says something along the lines of, "Well, we had to give them more instant gratification, kill and get treasure and repeat." The idea that she had the arrogance to tell people who had been playing the game with little to no content that they just wanted more instant gratification was pure lunacy. The game certainly needed changes, but if you can't please people who actually bought the game, you shouldn't be worried about pleasing the people who didn't buy the game, and likely wouldn't ever buy the game. Making the game closer to WoW isn't indicative of it being any more successful, because it was a different crowd. If the SOE devs actually took the time to listen to the community, they would have known that the NGE implementation they had planned was not what was wanted. There was a reason that the community manager at the time of SOE had a staunch stance against that update and then was promptly fired. SOE could have collectively bargained with the consumers, and the consumers could have gotten features that the game needed, like a tutorial system, and a system that would have also been lucrative to new players. Not only would they have been able to give the current players new features, they could have created things like I said, the tutorial system that could have also been good for new players or simplified the combat, other things that could be lucrative to new players. Instead, they had large changes forced on them in an instant, and then when questioned, the developers in suits of SOE and Lucas basically told the fans that they were being irrational and that change was needed, or that their opinions didn't really matter. Once they lost the trust of their fans and the consumer base, they killed much of their chances of success, especially when the media outlets started to pick up on the game and the story and how SOE handled it all, and just they were crucified. They had a negative public stigma around them, and it was a cloud that they could just really never get rid of. In conclusion, SOE, known as Daybreak Games now, as it was bought out by a venture capitalist company and then renamed, to this day has killed over 17 games, about 10 of which were MMOs. Games' popularity and longevity eventually do fade away, at least unless the game developers make constant upgrades or new additions to the game franchise, say for example World of Warcraft or Lord of the Rings. However, in SOE's case, many of the MMOs were killed in a way that some would call premature, likely in a result of poor handling. When SOE and LucasArts killed Star Wars Galaxies, they killed one of the last remaining true sandboxes. Although SOE was vilified for their handling of the game, and rightfully so, I don't think they ever had intentions of being negative or making poor decisions. Unfortunately, SOE as a company was one that made considerable bad decisions, which explains why their kill count in games is so high. But SOE was, at least early on, a company willing to try new things and willing to break the mold of what a traditional game was. However, they were really only known as being strong starters and weak finishers. SOE deserves some level of credit with what they were able to accomplish with their games, specifically Star Wars Galaxies, but you can't blame people for having negative views of them, especially when many of their poor decisions affected thousands and were in the public eye. After watching this video, my goal is to not have the watchers wanting to put SOE on a pike, or what's left of them. I want you guys to understand the true story behind Star Wars Galaxies, the tragedy being the best way to put it. It was a game that did much and had a strong Star Wars brand, but it was mishandled over a long period of time. Still, it's not all negative, as without companies like SOE to do the Star Wars Galaxies game, we would have never been able to play the game in the first place and create great memories with the game. But just remember that it wasn't a single moment that killed the game, CU or NGE. There's far more to the story. Hopefully other companies can learn from the game's demise. I loved the game. I played Galaxies for years, and I played it for hours in a day. It's quite possibly one of my favorite MMO experiences, and I played it through nearly every single change that there was. Just like other players, I have every reason to be annoyed at SOE and LucasArts for how they handled the game. But ultimately, I know that they did what they thought was the right thing to do, and they were wrong. And there's really nothing more to the story other than that. You can be mad about it, but it happened already. Now, the good news is, if you want to play the pre-CU Star Wars Galaxies version, you currently can. There's a SWGEMU, which is a Star Wars Galaxies emulator based in the pre-CU universe. You can just Google that, or I'll put a link right here, and you can go check that one out. Or, if you're more of a fan of the most implemented NGE version, I think it's up to like patch 16.4 or something like that, or chapter 16.4. Don't quote me on that. But if you want to play the NGE version, which added a lot more new content to the game and fixed a lot of the previous problems, then you can go check out Cerebellum. I will also link them in the description, and even better is you can play on the server, which launches this Friday, live, starting from scratch. So if you've ever wanted to play the NGE, or at least give it a try, you're welcome to do that, and you can do that on this Friday. If you haven't played the NGE, or you did play it briefly and you remember all those negative memories that you have, I would at least give it a try, because I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with a lot of the cool features that it did add to the game. Thanks for watching the video, guys, and if you liked it or disliked it, let me know in the comments below. If you did like it, make sure to like the video and subscribe to see more content like this. This will be an ongoing series I have, and one that I'm really excited to continue. nerdSlayer out.
And may the Force be with you always.